Okay, this is my presentation on intimate partner violence, or IPV, in a patriarchal society. Now, intimate partner violence, or IPV, is defined by Wallace Robertson and Globe Park 2019, page 55, as partner abuse refers to intentional harm, physical, emotional, or sexual, in any serious relationship, including marriage, cohabitation, or separation, and applies to all genders. Now, well, it's important to note that there's a distinction between domestic violence and IPV before we continue, as domestic violence can affect other family members, such as children, and is not therefore limited to just intimate partners, as is with IPV. Now, the reason why I chose to develop into the patriarchal system within IPV is because it is so profound and so deeply rooted that it is what I feel the more cause that linked all the articles together, thereby kind of coming up with a conclusion how deeply rooted it can be in its effects, as well as its challenges for its survivors, by allowing the stigmatization to further cause consequences already through their suffering of the abuse. Now, gaining deeper understanding of IPV and its effects can further get awareness of this issue and potentially be able to alleviate the problem. Next, we'll be talking about patriarchy and its role in IPV. Now, if we look at the patriarchy theory, we can see that in Creating Love, John Bradshaw defines patriarchy as a social system where male authority dominates, especially in family and religious roles. He explains that the patriarchal roles like obedience, emotional repression, and suppression of independent thinking still influence religion, schools, and family life. Both males and females are socialized into these values, starting with lessons from mothers and continuing through schools and religious institutions. This was founded by Hooks 2025, page 5. Now, in accordance to this quote, we can understand that just at the beginning of childhood, we are represented with these gender roles, therefore being institutionalized more as we get older through different systems, such as prevention in school. So society is just introducing this because it's so deeply rooted within generations. We're just continuing the cycle of abuse. Now, this system reinforces male entitlement and uses violence to maintain this male dominance in relationships because it normalizes male control, making violence seem necessary to uphold these power dynamics. Now, patriarchy theory connects to male entitlement based because intimate partner violence is linked to the social structures that promote the male dominance and female submission, making women more vulnerable to abuse because, as per mentioned, it perpetuates gender roles based on perceived superiority and inferiority. Now, on the male entitlement side, we can state that Bancroft-Zimmerman and Ritchie 2011 that the batterer's sense of entitlement justifies using violence or intimidation to protect his status. Believing violence toward a partner is justified, which will further predict which men will batter and helps identify boys exposed to domestic violence who may later abuse their partners. Again, we will further develop into this whole dynamic of growing from a child to witnessing domestic abuse to even become a perpetrator themselves, just the effects of children and family. Next, we're going to be talking about patriarchy in the media, but I just want to give forewarning that there is going to be an example of a woman, a celebrity, who has experienced IPV, and in this image it shows bruises and lacerations, and if uncomfortable, please skip ahead. This is just a trigger warning, so I will continue now. Okay, so again, the media portrayal of toxic relationships. Now, the media often reinforces patriarchal gender roles by normalizing the sexual objectification of women, presenting it as entertainment. This aligns with traditional portrayals of gender roles, which contribute to social learning and perpetuate attitudes that enable IPV to persist in future generations, as we mentioned. Now, an example of this is founded by Corbell 2018, page 5, as it states, Hollywood sexism and lack of women in power mean that entertainment is largely created by men. We often mistake this male-driven narrative for reality, believing it's fictional take on life, when in fact it's his version, where she says no but doesn't mean it. Now, this whole idea of Hollywood projecting women in this way, again, reinforces and enables the idea that women are supposed to be viewed as objects, which therefore kind of creates this whole mindset as children, because in this article, we can see that the author provides an example in which, for instance, those in romantic movies are often seen as women who resist a man trying to kiss her, but then later on just kind of accepts it. And we kind of all think that this is an issue of love and infatuation, but in reality, we kind of see this whole distinction of this is what males believe we want. But in reality, when put this example to the test, you can see this kind of creates disparities of how women actually perceive unwanted affection from men. Now, if we look at figure 1 from Olofo 2016, we can see a famous IPV controversy, which is between the case of Rihanna and Chris Brown. And it can provide more insight into how complicated abuse can be within IPV, as the struggle victims may face when deciding whether to leave or forgive their abuser. They were in a relationship in 2009 when, just before the Grammys, Chris Brown was arrested for assaulting Rihanna. But due to Rihanna reconciling with Chris Brown, it sparked controversy over the issue of forgiving an abuser. Therefore, the focus more on her being a victim was more now put on whether or not she was, like, how serious the situation was. Next, we're going to be talking about the forms of IPV shaped by patriarchal norms, in which case we're going to be focusing on physical abuse first. Now, physical abuse in IPV includes acts such as hitting, choking, and restraining, which, depending on their severity, can cause significant physical harm. Patriarchy instills the idea that men have the right to discipline their partners, especially if they act out. Now, this belief of male entitlement to control may manifest in physical violence as a way for men to gain further control. Now, we'll further go into how in certain cultures, patriarchy that is more deeply rooted will cause and more IPV to exist. due to its acceptance of social normalities, but again, that's for later. Next, we're talking about the emotional and psychological aspect of the abuse. Now, this includes tactics like coercion and manipulation, isolating and controlling women with threats that prevent them from leaving. The abuser often uses the cycle of violence, alternating between abuse with calm periods, and this can make it harder for victims to escape. Now, as noted from Bancroft, Zimmerman, and Vichy, 2011, page 17, after abusive incidents, the abuser may manipulate his partner's perception of the event, confusing her about its causes, a form of mind control. This is followed by calm periods, where the abuser acts loving to regain trust, giving the victims false hope of change. Now, these good moments can confuse the victim due to the trauma of previous abuse, creating strong trauma bonds that outsiders may not understand. Now, this manipulation can go so far as to distort the victim's self-perception, leading to feelings of guilt and failure. Now, this can interplay with societal stigma and patriarchal norms, as it can both allow the reinforcement of these feelings, making women believe that the abuse is their fault and that they deserve it, which further develops learned helplessness, where victims may come to a situation where they feel like there's no way out and they're stuck. Next, we'll be looking at the component of financial abuse. Now, a key aspect of emotional abuse is financial control. The abuser may force the spouse to hand over her paycheck, control all finances, and deny her any unapproved funds. This isolation and control prevents her from improving herself and increase feelings of helplessness. Even if she wanted to leave, she would have no money to support herself or find a place to stay. This was found by Wallace Robertson and Gorpart, 2019, page 76. Now, this form of abuse ties into patriarchal systems because this is where a man is typically seen as the head of the household and controls the economic resources. By denying the victim financial independence, the abuser ensures that they will remain dependent on them, therefore making it more difficult to escape the cycle of abuse, especially when considering the factor of marriage. As noted by Wallace Robertson and Gorpart, 2019, page 61, note, this dependency on a man and marriage for economic, emotional, and other support increases a woman's tolerance for physical abuse. Strauss and Glass and their associates conducted an in-depth study of dependency and violence and report that women whose dependency on marriage is high tend to suffer more physical violence than a woman whose dependency is low. Dependent wives have fewer alternatives to marriage and fewer resources within the marriage with which to cope or modify their husband's behavior. This dependency is a pair of golden handcuffs that bind the spouse to the abusive partner, end quote. Therefore, in correlation to this quote, we can see that certain cultural practices, such as forced arranged marriages aimed at enhancing just solely the family status or alleviating their poverty, leave women like this especially vulnerable to increased risk of IPV. Next, we're going to be talking about the marital rape. Now, marital rape, or the forced sexual relations between married partners, is another form of IPV, rooted in patriarchal beliefs and male entitlement. Marriage has historically always been seen as giving a man the right to control his wife, as well as the right to be able to enact into sexual intercourse, even through force. And even today, many cultures still view marital rape as acceptable. Now, this was found by Wallace Robertson and Gorpart, 2019, page 469. In the 1970s, the feminist movement fought to make marital rape a crime, facing strong resistance, including dismissive remarks from lawmakers. Some opposed the Bible. Some argue that Bible opposed state involvement in private matters, while others questioned if a husband could rape anyone but his wife. Despite this, advocacy led to legal changes that allowed husbands to be prosecuted for marital rape. Now, we can see from Figure 2 from Sager, 2018, the stats on marital rape. We can indicate that in many countries, marital rape is not explicitly defined as a crime. In others, including the countries below, rape in marriage is permissible. Now, if we kind of just look at just one example, such as the Bahamas, we can see in 2009, an MP introduced a legislative bill that would criminalize marital rape. In the face of considerable opposition, the legislation was abandoned. Now, furthering this notion, cultural differences can increase harmful practices, allowing women to experience marital rape in their own homes by legally allowing a rapist as an intimate partner. As in certain cultures, patriarchal norms often minimize the severity of marital rape, normalizing sexual violence within their own marriage. These just show how deeply rooted societal beliefs may dictate that a wife's role is only to serve her husband, undermining her autonomy and overall consent. This quote was found by Sager, 2018, page 48, which states, marry a rapist loss. Legal codes in many countries allow a rapist to avoid punishment if he marries his victim, in most cases, whether she agrees to the marriage or not. In the name of preserving family honor, is often family members who coerce women victims into these marriages. Again, end quote. This just shows that this whole idea of a patriarchal system now corresponds to the idea that those who inflict pain don't get punished, but rather get the ability to enact more pain, which is it really allowing punishment for the perpetrator or allowing further punishment for the victim? Next, we're going to be talking about the gender and IPV demographics. Now, IPV affects all genders, but women are more disproportionately impacted, especially considering sexual orientation and gender identity, as LGBTQ+ individuals experience IPV at rates comparable to or higher than heterosexual individuals due to unique barriers. As stated by Wallace Robertson and Gorpart, 2019, page 59, quote, LGBTQ+ victims of intimate partners abuse face unique barriers, including isolation, fear, discrimination from authorities, and concerns about being outed, which can deter them from reporting abuse. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence highlights that challenges like the belief that domestic violence doesn't occur in LGBTQ+ relationships, societal anti-LGBT bias, lack of service provider training, and the risk of shelters denying transgender victims based on gender or legal status, end quote. Therefore, when taking into account Figure 3, found by Demographics and Domestic Violence 2015, it shows that heterosexual women are more likely to experience IPV compared to their male counterparts. This trend is reflected within the LGBTQ+ community, as again, women are facing higher IPV rates than men. It is also important to recognize that the power dynamics and societal roles shape the way men and women experience and use violence. While male violence often leads to more severe injuries due to physical strength, women's violence generally causes less harm. However, that doesn't mean that the effects of female perpetrated violence on men should be dismissed. As noted by Bancroft, Silverman, and Vichy, 2011, page 174, quote, Johnston, Campbell, and Ross describe a type of domestic violence where women initiate physical assaults, though Men may also be violent. During separation, men may lose control and escalate violence in response. While women often cause minor damage, gender bias may lead to men not being seen as provoked. The authors note that while type B women don't see themselves as fearful, many admit to starting violence while still experiencing fear and psychological abuse. End quote. This can further show the kind of disparities between both genders, as men aren't always seen as being the victim in these situations because IPV correlates more higher to males being the perpetrators, as well as women tend to use violence as a way of protection based on previous history of violence. Next, we'll be talking about the IPV demographic of race and ethnicity. Now, patriarchy increases violence against women and creates disparities among ethnic groups. Minority women face obstacles in leaving abusive relationships, like limited resources and discrimination. These challenges make it harder for victims to seek help. And the stronger the patriarchy is in a culture, the more these issues tend to persist, normalizing abuse and affecting women's self-perception. As noted, we can see in correlation to figure 4 from SIGGR 2018, the stats on cultural acceptance for IPV. In justified beatings, percentage of women and men aged 15 to 49 who say a husband is justified in hitting or beating his wife from one or more of 5 reasons: burning food, arguing with him, going out without telling him, neglecting the children, and refusing sex. Now, surprisingly, in most countries, women are more willing than men to say that wife beating may be justified. Now, again, we can see that just with this quote, that the self-perception is so deep that now women are starting to believe that their value is worth less than a man, and that they are more that they can deserve to feel and be treated and violated and abused in ways that societal norms have caused them to believe. Next, we're going to be talking about the misconceptions about IPV and its perpetrators. Now, before we begin, many IPV perpetrators deny responsibility, blaming things like violence, mental health, or substance abuse. This highlights that the manipulative tactics they use to maintain control. In a patriarchal system, these behaviors are so linked to broader gender inequalities, which allow male abusers to just exploit these excuses and face little to none punishment due to these excuses. One of them is being generalized violence and criminality. Now, a common myth is that abusers have a history of violence, but in reality, they often target their partners solely, using control and manipulation to avoid consequences by silencing their victims. This was found by Bancroft, Silverman, and Ritchie, 2011, page 26, which notes that most of our clients, including those who are severely violent, have not exhibited chronic violence outside of intimate relationships. Research shows that while batterers may have higher rates of general violence compared to non-batterers, they typically limit their violence to intimate relationships. They are not generally viewed as violent by others, except in situations where their control over partners or children is challenged. Now, again, we can see that this challenge, trying to make control, is a reason for someone to, or the perpetrator to act out in a violent way, but they tend to hide it and isolate it towards more of their partners. Next, we'll be looking at the mental health aspect of the excuse that they use, which they say that the cause of IPV should not be attributed solely to mental health issues in perpetrators, as there is no direct correlation between psychopathology and abusive behavior. While perpetrators may be more likely to exhibit antisocial and narcissistic traits, these behaviors are not just the only reason for IPV to exist, as antisocial personality disorders is linked to domestic battering, with batterers at higher risk for this diagnosis. However, it should be seen as a co-occurring issue and not a direct cause, found by Bancroft, Silverman, and Ritchie, 2011, page 23. Next, we're looking about substance abuse. Now, perpetrators of IPV may blame alcohol for their behavior, manipulating their partners into thinking the abuse is due to intoxication. This excuse allows the abuser to justify their actions to continue the abuse, often becoming more severe when drinking, as the abuser feels empowered to harm their partner without facing any consequences. Quote, when a battered partner claims violence only occurs during drinking, further questioning often reveals that the lower level violence happens at other times. Even if substance abuse intensifies violence, it remains a choice. Many abusers admit to being more violent while intoxicated and show similar behavior whether sober or drunk. Lesbian batterers exhibit similar patterns. Founded by Bancroft, Silverman, Ritchie, 2011, page 22. Again, this just further goes to show that the excuse and manipulation tactics used. Now, next we're going to be talking about the IPV is only among certain racial and cultural groups misconception, because even though patriarchy exists, it also just not only just kind of puts down women, but it also puts down ethnic groups, as previously mentioned, as minority groups often face additional disparities due to stereotypes that label them as having more violent nature based just solely on the environment itself. This can lead to prejudice and discrimination within the justice system, with assumptions that they are more likely to be perpetrators of IPV. However, these factors should not define behavior. Instead, responsibility of IPV should be based on individual autonomy. Now, quote, even in cultures with male dominance, abusers often believe they have a right to exert power. However, global efforts against domestic violence are increasing, with 53 countries passing laws against it and 41 criminalizing marital rape. No culture broadly condones domestic violence. Founded by Bancroft, Silverman, Ritchie, 2011, page 27. Next, we're looking at the impact of IPV on victims and society. Now, just looking solely at the emotional and psychological consequences, IPV has deep psychological effects worsened by victim blaming rooted in patriarchal norms. This cycle of trauma makes it harder for victims to leave, as fear, judgment, or disbelief keeps them from seeking help, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. This quote was found by Wallace Robertson, Glover, 2019, page 96, which states that victims of IPV have higher rates of anxiety and depression, often replaying the abuse in their minds, feeling emotionally detached and experiencing sleep disturbances. IPV also leads to social isolation as victims withdraw due to shame, increasing their vulnerability to further abuse. Next, looking at the long-term physical health effects, a study in Australia found that women with physical and intellectual disabilities are more likely to experience severe, prolonged IPV and face greater barriers to seeking help. Pregnant women are at higher risk, with nearly 60% of those abused by a former partner reporting violence during pregnancy. Among these, 36 were abused during pregnancy and 17 for the first time, with higher severity and frequency of violence, including increased psychological abuse. Founded by Wallace Robertson, Glover, 2019, page 96. Next, we'll be looking at the impact on children of future generations. Now, children who witness IPV are more likely to replicate violent behaviors in their own relationships. Boys often model aggressive behavior, while girls may internalize the belief that they should accept the abuse in relationships. The normalization of violence within the home creates cycles of abuse that extends across generations. Now, this quote was founded by Bancroft, Sloman, and Ritchie, 2011, page 91, which states that adolescents may turn against their mother in an attempt to win the approval, love, and affection of the father as they begin to identify with the power of the abuser. They may have seen that there are no negative consequences for the abusive behavior, or the abuse, use of power control, and they may begin to model aggression behavior in their own relationships with peers and with their mother. Now, witnessing IPV can have lasting emotional, psychological, and social effects on children, influencing their behavior and future relationships. It normalizes aggression, especially in boys, reinforcing gender disparities and distorted masculinity. Exposure increases the likelihood of engaging in IPV, as societal patriarchy and gender norms intersect with violent exposure. This aligns with the cycle of violence theory, which suggests that witnessing violence in children increases the chances of becoming a perpetrator in adulthood, which was found by Willis Robertson and Goldberg, 2019. Now, another quote I felt heavily to talk about was within Hook's 2022, page 6, which states that sexist violence is often discussed in terms of rape and domestic abuse, but the most common form occurs within the home, where patriarchal parents use violence to reinforce a dominator role. This model places the authority figure in control, justifying the role through subjection and submission. Again, highlighting the notion that within the home, we can see that the prevalence of gender roles are becoming more normalized within children, allowing this occurrence of society to continue amongst generations of this disparity of IPV. Now, what are the barriers to seeking help? Now, a major barrier to escaping IPV is the fear of judgment and victim blaming. Survivors may worry that they won't be believed or they'll be judged for even staying in the predicament, but the justice system, often influenced by the patriarchal values, frequently fails to protect its victims, making them less likely to further seek help. This quote was found by Bancroft, Sloman, and Ritchie, 2011, page 77, which states that additionally, legal issues like weak protections and poorly enforced restraining orders also make it tough for survivors to find safety or justice. These challenges create a difficult environment for victims to escape or seek help. Many victims of abuse by police officers avoid reporting it, fearing that colleagues of the abuser will side with him and fail to investigate properly. A study by Lott found that law enforcement agencies often handle such cases informally without official complaints or records. End quote. Next, we'll be looking at a couple narratives I found. Now, the first one states that I sent photos when he asked. I had sex when he asked, even if it meant crying my way through it. I slept facing him when he asked, because if I rolled over, he would say clearly I was no longer interested in him. Anytime I used him in any way, it resulted in a fight that I couldn't win. Then came the threats. This was found by F, 2024, page 3. Again, this goes to show the manipulation tactics. This kind of cycle of violence continues, later on becoming more increasingly IPV starting to implement its way in the relationship. And in the article itself, clearly you can see this increasement. Next, we're going to be talking about this quote from Rithora, 2024, page 5, which starts as, "The babies kept coming, 4 children in 5 years. She told herself she could put up with the violence because she only saw her husband a few times a year. He was away on business a lot, or at least she thought that's what he told her, because she discovered later that some of those business trips were cover stories hiding his affairs, and they were well off financially. Their lives were filled with private school and a swimming pool and ski trips. I grew up in trailer court in Gallup, New Mexico, so that was pretty nice. I have a lot of shame that I traded their innocence for material things instead of taking them to safety," she said. Again, this shows the correlation of dependency, especially that financial component we were talking about previously, about how they are more likely to stay in that relationship if financially they have that attachment and need to be able to have that support from that male. Now, when it comes to children's involvement, it makes it even harder for these victims to be able to leave because they want what's best for their children, especially when it comes to getting the bare minimum of shelter and food and clothes, etc. Therefore, in conclusion, IPV is a societal epidemic which is rooted in patriarchal structures that normalizes gender inequality. Patriarchy perpetrates abuse by maintaining gender power imbalances. Addressing IPV requires challenging these norms, and this will allow to dismantle systems that allow, for the first place, gender balance to even thrive. Therefore, supporting its victims to allow for a healthy relationships to arise through listening to their stories and increasing involvement through policies, legislation, change. Next, we can see a list of my references I have used within this presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed.